queue. We will begin in just under a minute. Hello, and welcome to iBwave's Deep Dive webinar on connecting the corporate HQ. My name is Mary Claire Charlton, and I work in marketing and communications at iBwave. We're very excited to be with you today presenting our new Deep Dive webinar series, where we take our advanced research findings and apply them to real-life cases and venues to deliver practical and technical indoor wireless knowledge that you can apply. Our speaker today is Vladan Javremovic, our research director here at iBwave. Vladan has 20 years of professional experience in the wireless telecommunication industry and 13 years of experience in in-building. At iBwave, he's the principal architect of RF propagation and optimization algorithms applied in our in-building design and planning tools, and he also develops technical courses offered through our iBwave certification program. Vladan holds a PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder. We're very excited about today's topic, connecting the corporate HQ. I recently saw results from a survey that stated nearly 74% of consumers would potentially leave their current mobile operator to receive better cellular service at work. This data illustrates that there's a problem with reliable indoor coverage in workplaces and proves there's a compelling business opportunity for mobile operators. In just a few minutes, Vladan will go into more detail on this, but before we begin, I just have a few short housekeeping items to mention. So first of all, thank you for all the questions you sent while you registered for the webinar. If you have any additional questions, you can type them into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can during the last 15 minutes of the session. And we'll respond to any of the remaining ones after the webinar privately. We'll also be tweeting throughout the webinar, and we encourage you to join us if you're on Twitter. You can follow us at iBwave and use the hashtag iBwaveTalks. And feel free to ask your questions on Twitter as well. For those who may have audio difficulties, we will try to speak as loudly and clearly as possible, but please make sure to check your own audio settings when you log in. We'll be recording today's webinar and sending the recording as well as the slide deck to everyone via email within the next couple of days. And the recording will also be available on the iBwave website within the next couple of days. So here's the part where we talk about iBwave for just about a minute. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, iBwave is a global provider of innovative in-building wireless software solutions to help operators, system integrators, and equipment manufacturers better design and plan multi-technology wireless networks inside buildings and venues. And you can learn more about our software suite and our in-building training on our website, iBwave.com. Now, without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Vladan, who will get into today's topic.
Thank you, Mary Claire. Hello, everybody. My name is Vladan Javremovic, and I will be presenting on connecting to the corporate headquarters today, which is the next in our deep dive webinar series. Our agenda today is as follows. We will start talking about what is the campus, what is the business campus, the description of the general business campus, and then we will explain what is particular example that we will be looking in today, the example of the corporate headquarters. We'll be talking about the in-building system design requirements for the corporate headquarters, and we will be talking about best design practices, best in-building system design practices. In particular, we will be looking into RF survey, how RF survey helps doing the good in-building system design. We'll be talking about 3D modeling, how important it is for a proper in-building system design. We will talk about in-building system containment and how significant that is for good network performance. And a very important topic, which is elevator coverage. We have already received plenty of questions even before this webinar as to how properly to cover elevators and other hard-to-get areas. Handoff management is important because good system design includes the minimum number of handoffs in a very defined areas. So we will talk about that as well. Then we will present what we believe would be most optimum solution, in-building system solution for this specific use case, and then show 2D and 3D RF coverage maps for key performance indicators for the technologies that are included in this in-building design. Then we will go into conclusion. We will recap our presentation today, what we have learned, and then after that we will go to the Q&A. So let's get started. What is a business campus? Typically, those are office buildings, 2 or more, that are located off major road or major streets. They typically are multi-level story buildings, and there are no restaurants or cafes or cinemas or retail shops or anything that actually exists in those buildings aside from office space. There may be a cafeteria, but that really is not a restaurant. The point being is that what we have in those buildings is a heavy wireless traffic in working hours between 9 to 5. And then that traffic, wireless traffic, dies off as the employees started to leave, and there is almost no traffic at night and on weekends. So that's about as broad definition as you can have of a business campus. Whether one particular company resides in all buildings in that campus, or whether multiple companies share the campus, or if multiple companies share a building, is really of a secondary importance. What is important is that we have heavy traffic that is located in those buildings during working hours. And at first, that traffic was covered by surrounding macro base stations in early days. Even though the penetration may or may not be good through the walls and windows, it was sufficient enough to provide coverage for mostly voice calls. And the situation has since changed, and now we see more and more requests for in-building systems coming from business campuses. For our particular case study, we looked into what we call enterprise headquarters. In this case, we have 2 buildings. One is 10 levels, the other one is 5 levels, and the distance between them is 30 meters. A single company resides in those 2 buildings, and so all the employees in those 2 buildings belong to one company. What is also common in those 2 buildings is that there is a slow data connection. Signal may or may not have 5 bars, but the employees try to connect to wireless network either to download data or to do video streaming or web browsing. They experience slow data connection. So that is the problem, and that is why this company wants to have in-building system. What is also very specific for this company is that employees use their own personal phones. This is a so-called bring your own device to work, or BYOD, which has been popular these days among the companies. Basically, they ask their employees to bring their own device, personal device to work, and use that for work during business hours, and then at the end of the month, they get reimbursed a portion of their wireless bill. So that is very important requirement for this particular case study, that there is no preferred carrier, no preferred wireless carrier, no preferred wireless service providers. So all major wireless service providers in the area are presented in this case study among the employees. So what are the design requirements? For the RF coverage, we want to have the following technologies included in in-building system: UMTS, LTE, and those are very well-known commercial technologies. And all the wireless service providers, that are multiple wireless service providers that will be included in this IBS, all of them have either UMTS in their network or LTE or both. So we have multiple operators, but all of them are using either UMTS or LTE or both. The building management also wanted to include public safety. So those three technologies, two commercial and one is a private, is public safety, they are required to be in building system. Now, to properly design for the system, IBS signal must be dominant. And we provide that dominance by requiring that the signal strength in IBS should be stronger than the residual macro, 5 to 7 dB stronger or better. So we have taken a snapshot from our iBwave design tool that actually shows that dominance over macro map. What we have is those 4 antennas transmitting, and then they provide in-building system signal. But we have assumed that there is a macro signal just outside of this building that penetrates the building. So this dominance over macro, this is the map that you will see in our new release 6.6, which will be out shortly. Now this map actually shows you how much dominance of in-building signal you have over macro. It is required to be at least 7 dB, okay, maybe 5. So what you really see is that green area and this yellow area is where you have fulfilled those requirements. And the red and the black, that's where you don't have the dominance. But you may have areas of the building, maybe lower floors or maybe even garage underground, where the macro signal is very, very low. Maybe your LTRS RP signal is closer to neg 110 dBm. So in that case, alternative minimum values for technologies should be adopted. For LTE, the absolute minimum, design minimum for RSRP is neg 95 dBm. For UMTS SIPH is neg 85 dBm. So public safety is neg 75 dBm. So the signal is 5 to 7 dB stronger than macro, but no less than neg 95 dBm for LTE RSRP, neg 85 dBm for UMT SIPH, and neg 75 dBm for public safety. Now, as for the other requirements, stairwells and elevators must be included. This is going to be, we're going to be talking about this on the next several slides, but this is very important. As for interference management, the signal leakage from in-building system to outdoor should be minimized. The sector overlap should be minimized, and handoff occurrences should be limited. So as few handoffs as possible. And but also we need to be mindful that public safety has additional design requirements, and this is typical. And those additional design requirements are technological, regulatory, and judicial. Of interest is that we need to have more extensive coverage for public safety than for wireless service providers. That's because public safety needs to cover areas where maintenance personnel is usually going to, and that is the area that will be also of interest to first responders. And that is loading docks area, electrical rooms, and freight elevators. So general public doesn't go there, but first responders also have to go there, so that is why we have a more extensive coverage for public safety. Also, that network needs redundancy, whereas wireless service provider network does not need that. Now, public safety may operate in the SMR band, which is 800 megahertz, and downlink of that band may interfere with the uplink of the cellular band, which is 850. And this is a very important technological requirement because that leads us to having to separate public safety antenna from the wireless service provider's antenna a certain distance to actually mitigate this problem if we have SMR band right next to a cellular band on the network. Now, there are regulatory and judicial requirements. Regulatory requires, among other things, a waterproof NEMA enclosure. It may also require a backup battery. A judicial, that public safety network must be controlled and maintained by public safety authority. So we cannot have, AT&T engineer or or maybe a third-party engineer actually trying to adjust any levels for public safety. It has to strictly be somebody from the Public Safety Authority. So those are additional design requirements that we need to be mindful of. Now let's move on to best practices. RF survey. We said that we want to have dominant IBS signal at least 5 to 7 dB stronger than the residual macro. And so that what means is that we have to determine what is the residual macro signal, and we need to determine that for all carriers and all technologies. So ideally, what would happen is that we would do the survey on each floor, but that is time-consuming because we have to do RF survey of macro signal on each floor for every wireless service provider. May not have enough time, so there are two ways how to do a proper approximation of residual macro signal. The first one is to actually do a survey on if there is a layout, a floor plan layout is similar or almost identical between several consecutive floors, then what it could be done is do the RF survey every third floor and then interpolate the macro residual RF signal value at those floors that are in between the floors where you did take the survey. The second one is to recognize the fact that the RF signal varies with height. And there are a couple of references, and I have marked them here, but I don't really have the links because there was not enough space to show on this slide. But basically they say that the signal will increase 1 to 3 dB per floor. And that increase will go on up until you actually reach the floor. It is about the same height as surrounding base stations. And from that point forward, that signal will level off and keep at a certain level. So what you can do, knowing that, is to do an RF survey on the ground level and then add, a couple of dBs per floor up until, let's say, I don't know, maybe floor 20 or whatever the height of the surrounding base station is, and then keep that signal constant as you go above the 20th floor. And I have illustrated that in those snapshots that you see here. The signal on the first floor, you see that it is fairly low, the residual macro signal is, lots of dark blue and some black. When you move to the 6th floor, I was adding, added about 10 dB to this outside macro signal because it is 2 dB per floor. Now you see a little bit more light blue. And then finally, when you get to 10th floor, there is quite a bit of green actually at the peripheral area of that floor. So that shows you how the macro residual signal goes up with height. Now, 3D modeling. IBS signal propagates between floors, we all know that, but it also propagates in between buildings. So the buildings must be properly modeled, and especially the windows. So why am I emphasizing windows? It's because some older windows have low penetration loss, but the newer ones have metallic parts, metallic film in them. And there is a metallic film is there to reflect the light better off of windows. But that metallic film also acts as a very high RF signal attenuator. So those newer windows have high penetration loss. And that difference between low penetration loss and high penetration loss can be significant. And if you are not sure which window type your building has, then CW propagation loss test should be done. Basically, put a CW transmitter on the inside next to the window and transmit outside, and then go outside a few meters away from the window and collect the received signal strength and figure out what the penetration loss is. It is going to be very important, and it is going to be very important in the in-building signal containment, which is the next topic of best practices. We want this in-building signal to be confined indoors. If it is not, I may have a signal from one building overlap with signal from the other building. And that overlap may happen in a parking lot, but it may happen inside the other building as well, depending on what kind of window penetration loss I have. And most operators recognize that, and they stipulate that the signal level outside of the building should drop off to significantly low level. For example, for LTR SRP, they may require that signal to be neg 100 dBm or less at 30 meters away from the building. And a similar requirement for UMTS, for SIPICs to be neg 90 dBm at 30 meters away. So that's why that is very important, the window penetration loss. And I have given you illustration as to how it looks in a 3D. Basically, what you have is two antennas on the first floor, and this is how that coverage on the first floor looks like outside of the building. So now that we know that carriers would like to keep that signal outside of the building low, what can we do to contain that signal? Well, one thing that we should not do is to use omnidirectional antennas near windows, because they will transmit everywhere, including through the window, and if that window penetration loss is low, then we may have significant signal leakage outside. And here in this example, I show you those omnidirectional antennas. And we have said that for UMTS, we would want to have RSCP to be neg 90 dBm 30 meters away. So we really would want to see something light blue from coming around here at the smaller building. So here I would like to see light blue signal, but I'm seeing yellow and I'm seeing green. And green is neg 75. So this is significantly higher than what the requirement is. So antennas are where I pointed with those red arrows. Now, the exception to this rule should be done if we have windows that are newer, that have a very high penetration loss due to metallic window tint, which we mentioned earlier. So now what to do? Well, I'm giving you an example of using a specific directional antenna. This is just an example of something that we have in our database. You may want to use something else. But this particular Andrew Selmax D25 antenna with the front-to-back ratio of 20 dB, an antenna gain of almost 5 dBd, actually helped to reduce quite a bit that signal leakage. If you look now, you will see that I do have blue areas, which is near that building, the second building 30 meters away, which was something that I wanted to see. I don't see yellow anymore, and green area is much reduced. What I also have is what they call corner office problem. Because of the large front-to-back ratio, the signal that comes into corner office is much lower than it was before. I still have a decent coverage percentage throughout the building. My energy is directed, toward the inside of that floor plan, which is what it's supposed to be. But the signal in the corner office has dropped very close to neg 85 dBm, which is my lowest acceptable level. So that you should be mindful that using those directional antennas may pose another problem, which is a corner office problem. Now, this is a very interesting topic, elevator coverage. So due to the metal doors and walls, elevator has no coverage coming from the antennas that are scattered throughout the floor plan when the elevator doors are closed. So what I'm showing you here is I show those red triangles are basically directional antennas that are scattered throughout the floor plans. And I'm assuming that this building has three distinct sectors. The sector 1 covers 4 lower floors, and it is color-coded yellow. Then I have sector 2 that has 3 floors, and it's color-coded green. And finally, I have sector number 3, which is top 3 floors and is color-coded blue. And here, this area is elevator bank. It's basically the area in front of the elevators. And if you look into the previous picture, you will see that these two are elevators, and this is that elevator bank area. So no coverage, as you see from those coming from those directional antennas. Everything is dark blue and black. But this area in front of the elevator bank has a good coverage. So inside the elevator shaft, I will have no coverage. So what do I do? Well, there are 4 ways to solve the problem. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages, and we will cover them all. The first one is antennas at the bank. The second is a wired antenna inside the elevator. The third is antennas inside the shaft. And finally, we talk about radiating cable inside the shaft. We did say that there was a decent area in front of the coverage bank, but no coverage inside the elevator. What we would do, we would put antenna right at the elevator bank. And so why would that antenna provide coverage inside? It is because those metal elevator doors, if you observe them closely, when they close, it is never metal on metal. It is always a rubber there that acts, as to basically not to have those doors slam against each other. And that rubber will allow some signal to penetrate through. Whether that is enough, you need to do CW measurements test when the door is closed to see if you can actually get enough signal inside the elevator using that omnidirectional antennas. But if that is the case, then if you connect those antennas to corresponding sectors, this is what you will see. So basically, you just extended the coverage of each sector inside the elevator shaft and inside the elevator. Now, the problem with this solution is that you are going to have a UE that goes maybe from the top floor to the bottom floor, and it needs to do a handoff from the blue sector to green sector, and then from green to yellow, while it goes directly from the blue sector to yellow sector. Now, it takes about 2 to 3 seconds to do a handoff, but you have to assume that not all handoffs are successful. So maybe the first time you spent 2 to 3 seconds, did not do a handoff, then you try again, 2 to 3 seconds, did not do that, and then finally, you are doing it right, the third time around, but then already 10 seconds has passed and your elevator is at the bottom. It is not in the green sector anymore, which it is trying to hand off to. It is now at the yellow sector, and it's been 10 seconds, and then after the third unsuccessful try, the call is dropped. So that is the problem. May need 10 seconds to do a blue to green handoff, and you are already at the bottom floor during those 10 seconds and the call is dropped. So what you can do instead, all those omnidirectional antennas may be connected to a single sector. Let's say you connect them all to the blue sector. So that's great. You are going to have no drop calls because the elevator is going to be on in the blue area as well as those omnidirectional antennas. The only problem is that around that elevator bank area on each floor, which is sector 2 and sector 1, which is green and yellow floors, you will have that area where blue sector actually has coverage. So you're now going to have a permanent handoff zone near elevator bank at those floors. And that is not good because we have extensive sector overlap. Those horizontal sector overlaps, they're not good. So that is a problem. The second option is to put wired antenna inside the elevator, and that is a nice way to doing it. You will basically connect an omnidirectional antenna to an IBS sector via cable. And then your handoff occurs only when entering and exiting the elevator. There is no missed handoffs. And the horizontal sector overlap exists only when the elevator door is open. So I'm going to have the horizontal sector overlap between green and elevator or yellow an elevator only when the door is open. It is only several seconds. However, this is rarely deployed in North America because most municipalities consider cable inside the elevator shaft a fire hazard. So there is a problem with that. So the third option is actually to have, instead of that cable, to have a wireless connection. So now what we have is basically in the elevator, we have donor and server antenna. The server antenna is only inside the elevator. The donor is the directional antenna on top of the elevator car pointing up. And on top of the elevator shaft, we have in-building system directional antenna pointing down and transmitting toward the elevator car. So this is a solution that does not really require cables inside the shaft. The only cable that it requires is that short cable is going to connect the donor and server in the elevator. And that is usually half a meter cable. And now the question is, how much space can we cover using this? So I gave you an example here, assuming that 20 dBm C-pitch ERP at the IBS antenna and assuming a 85 dBm RSCP in elevator, the maximum distance in AWS band is approximately 115 meters. And it helps that that there is a tunnel effect in the elevator shaft. It helps by about 8 dB when you calculate link budget as per Morton Tolstrup's book. If the building is taller than 115 meters, then put another directional antenna at the bottom of elevator car, connect that to the serving antenna, and then another directional antenna connected to IBS at the bottom of the shaft pointing up. So now you have two IBS directional antennas feeding this elevator car a signal, one on top, one on the bottom. Now, when you have that situation, if you take into account the, let's say, 10 to 20% overlap margin, then you can cover 200 meters under these assumptions. And you have to calculate this for every technology, actually, and find the minimum distance among those technologies, and then you will see whether this building is too tall to be covered this way or not. And then another one, the fourth option is radiating cable inside the shaft. And this provides uniform coverage in the shaft, but unfortunately, it still may be considered as a fire hazard, by many municipalities. So those are four ways to provide coverage inside your elevator. Now, we mentioned the handoff management is important. It is important because we would like to minimize the number of handoffs, not only between micronetwork and in-building systems, but also between in-building system sectors. The handoff between micronetwork and in-building systems should be confined to entrances of the building, which is building lobby and loading dock. The handoff between IBS sectors can be vertical and horizontal. Vertical handoff is handoff, and when we say vertical, we mean physically, in between floors. So vertical handoff is between floors, and this handoff should be confined to stairwells. And the reason why that is because in stairwells, you actually have people moving slowly. So there is enough time to complete the handoff when people are using stairs. This should be avoided as much as possible in moving elevators because it may lead to drop calls, as we have mentioned earlier. Now, horizontal handoff is something that happens on the same floor. And typically, you don't really want that. You would want that floor to be completely the same sector. So you try to avoid that. Why? Because, well, imagine you have people working in cubicles that are in between two sectors. So they will constantly be ping-ponging between two sectors, and they may actually drop calls because of that. And your statistics will not look very good. But as we have shown before for elevator coverage, perhaps this is something that we cannot avoid if we connect those antennas at the banks, at the elevator banks. If we connect them to the same sector, then we may have a situation where there is a horizontal handoff near elevator banks, which sometimes may not be avoidable if we need coverage inside elevators. So what would be the IBS solution that we would recommend in this case? Well, the key requirement is for employees to use their own phones. That means that IBS system has to have multiple wireless service providers. Maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, depending on how many dominant wireless service providers we have amongst the population of those employees. So all those WSPs must be included in IBS, but wireless service providers don't like to share small cells. They would like to have their own small cell to own and operate. So what may happen, for example, if you have 4 wireless service providers to be included in that in-building network, then we will have 4 small cell networks, 1 for each wireless service providers. And this is not something that building managers would want to hear. So because of that, the optimal solution that we would recommend would be distributed antenna system. It can be active, it can be passive. It really depends on who or what you want to achieve. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages. We don't really have any recommendation for either of those two. Both can be good and both can be bad depending on what particular project you have. But distributed antenna solution, either active or passive, is recommended as a solution for this particular case study. Having said that, we can show a little bit of key performance indicators, or KPI, coverage maps, 2D and 3D. And for LTRSRP, this is the map. What you are seeing on the left-hand side, you see the first floor of Building 1 and Building 2, and the area in between them. I'm showing you the coverage inside the building and outside of the building for LTRSRP at AWS band. I am then showing you a 3D coverage for those 2 buildings. First floor, again, the same antenna, same location, and only in a 3D. Next one, the coverage of UMTS EC over I0. This is at the PCS band, and again 2D coverage and 3D coverage of the first floor, the first and the second building. The next one is LTSANR, an important map because it is related to maximum achievable data rate, or MADR. It is at AWS band LTE. Again, I'm showing you the coverage on the first floor for Building 1 and Building 2, and in between those 2 buildings, and 3D coverage. And finally, LT, maximum achievable data rate, or MADR. And interesting thing, as you may have concluded by looking by SANR, the SANR was not very good in between buildings because there was a sector overlap. We have different sectors for Building 1 and Building 2. And in the area where we have a sector overlap, we have a lower data rate. For example, you see inside buildings, data rate is high. And this is a CISO case. We did not apply MIMO. So the maximum achievable data rate was 41.3 megabits per second. It's a CISO node. So you see that inside buildings, there is quite a bit of a good signal data rate in most of it. There is a little bit of green in the middle of both, and there is quite a lot of green, which is a lower data rate, and even blue in between buildings because we have a signal overlap from those 2 buildings that is in the area of parking lot. So we have avoided a coverage overlap inside the buildings, but we do have it outside, and that is okay because we are not designing for the parking lot, we are designing for the buildings. So the summary of my presentation is as follows. We have talked about enterprise headquarters with this description. We have explained what our case study parameters are. We talked about design requirements, what they are for this particular case study. And we talked about best practices. We talked about how important RF survey is for proper design, 3D modeling, how important it is to do IBS signal containment, not to allow that to spill outside of the building. We talked about elevator coverage, how to achieve that, and in various ways, and we explained what the advantages and disadvantages of each particular approach is. Then we talked about handoff management. How should we provide for handoffs? What is desirable way to provide for a handoff in desirable locations, and which locations are not desirable for handoffs. We presented what we believe would be the optimum IBS solution for this particular case study, and that would be distributed on a system, whether passive or active, is pretty much up to the designer. And then we have shown 2D and 3D coverage maps. And with this, I'm concluding my presentation and turning over the microphone to Mary Claire Charlton.
Thank you, Vladan. If you liked the content of our presentation today, we invite you to join us for our next deep dive webinar, which is on June 3rd. Vladan will be talking about subway systems as an environment which definitely brings its share of challenges. So it's definitely going to be an informative session. You can pre-register for this one by emailing me directly, and I'll send you a confirmation email in a few weeks once I have the webinar set up. But again, it's June 3rd, and it's on subways. So we will now get to some of the questions that were asked during registration for the webinar and throughout the session today. So if you have any questions, you can still type them into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel or send them to iBwave on Twitter, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So here will be the first one, Vladan. How do you maintain the radio performance coverage capacity 1 to 5 years after commissioning?
Yes, so what needs to be done, it is really mostly the question of capacity. Coverage is something that usually will stay with you for if you do not have a need for more capacity. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that, for example, for new MTS, if you don't have a growth in customer base, you are happy with, let's say, 3 channels, UMTS channels. But if you have a capacity growth, then you have to add the 4th channel, and then your signal will be dropped. So basically, what you need to do is you need to assess what your capacity needs are going to be 5 years forward, and then you will figure out as to how many, let's say, UMTS channels you may have 5 years from now, and plan appropriately, because more channels you add, the less power per channel you will have there. So that is the issue. Now, as far as the capacity planning, this is really not the webinar when we wanted to address that. Actually, we will be doing that for our next webinar when we talk about subways and how to properly dimension in subways, taking into account, how many trains there may be during rush hour, and how many passengers in each train, and how many people that can be on a platform at any point in time, and then looking into what the usage pattern may be for those people that are actually commuting. And then based on that usage pattern, we can figure out what is going to be the call blocking, that is desirable call blocking in the subways, and then from there you can figure out how many people we may have per sector for that particular blocking rate. So the same thing can be done in this exercise. Figure out what is going to be acceptable number of sectors today, based on those parameters, based on the number of people that are in the building, based on the usage pattern as to what are users using web browsing, and how often are they using web browsing, what is the data rate for web browsing, and what other applications they're using, and all that. Once we figure out the number of people per sector, we can figure out how many sectors we have for today's needs. And then 5 years forward, we need to look historically what was the increase in data usage. And then that will help us figure out how many sectors we may need 5 years from now. But that is something that we will be talking in more details on the next webinar on subways.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here that was asked during the registration time about FDD and TD-LTE design combined best practices.
Yes, well, the difference between FTD and TDD is that TDD actually has to have a guard period when switching between uplink and downlink. So what you have is, let's say, a 10 millisecond frame, and there is 10 1 millisecond subframes. And each of those subframes can be transmission in uplink or downlink. So every time when there is a switch between uplink and downlink, there has to be a guard period when there is no transmission in order to allow all the signal, that are coming into the base station to arrive before base station starts to transmit. So that's basically a guard period that is preventing uplink and downlink signal from interfering with each other. Now, the longer the radius of the base station, the greater that guard time must be. Now, if you think about that guard time, that is a wasted time inside the frame because nothing is being transmitted in it. So it is not to our advantage to have a large guard time. It is not our advantage to have a large TDD cells, large as in, 10 kilometers. But that is really not the case for in-building systems. In in-building systems, our cells do not have a large radius. So this is really not an issue that the guard time is not really an issue for designing LT, TDD small cells. And a similar thing can be, similar case can be stated for FDD because there is a CP time, cycle prefix time, and there can be two values. There is a short CP and long CP. And, that long CP is basically doing the similar function as this blank transmission, which is to say that it provides silent time in between consecutive OFDM transmissions. And the long CP prefix is in bigger small cells, in bigger cell radiuses, but that is really not for our concern in those in-building systems because the distances are small. So typically what you would want to look into for macro networks does not really happen in in-building networks as far as TDD and FDD LTE is concerned, especially not in this connected headquarters case study. You may have something to look into if you are in a tunnel, which is something that we will be talking about in the next webinar in subways, whether you should be using, for example, long or short cycle prefix. And then we can look into what would happen if you also need to put LT, TDD on that network. So that may be of interest for subways depending on how long the tunnels are, but not for enterprise headquarters. We don't really have an issue with that for this particular case study.
Okay, thank you. Another question here, this one's on budget. Can you recommend design approaches to manage infrastructure costs, avoid over-designed and potentially cost-prohibitive solutions?
Yeah, well, we have talked about paying attention to the macro signal in our webinar. And we talked about the fact that macro signal is not really constant with height, right? So, for example, cost prohibitive would be if you just assumed in a building that, let's say, has 50 floors, that your macro signal will keep going up at the rate of 2 dB per floor from the first floor to the 50th floor. You have to recognize the fact that once you are above the height of the surrounding base stations, you're out of the main antenna lobe for those base stations, and because of that, the signal level is going to level off, the macro signal level. Yes, you will be seeing more base stations as you go up, but you are going to be out of the main lobe, so your signal is not going to go up, it will level off. So that is a good best practice for design in those very high business office buildings that may have 50 floors or so. And that will help you not to over-design the system, recognizing the fact that after the certain level, your residual macro signal will level off.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to take a question that just came in. In the elevator coverage slide number 14, how do you decide how many sectors you use inside the building?
Yes, we have, that is an exercise that we have omitted for the sake of brevity, and we talk about the capacity dimensioning in our next webinar on subways in much detail. And that is why we did not want to show in much detail how we calculated how many sectors we have for each technology and each wireless service operator. It is a very involved exercise that will probably take about 10 to 15 minutes to properly explain with all the intermediate steps, and we have saved that for the next webinar. So for the purpose of just illustrating what we wanted to show, and that is that we may have that elevator may rapidly go through consecutive handoff requests. We have shown a building with 10 floors and 3 different sectors. And the point of that was that I may need to go with the elevator directly from the top floor to the bottom floor, and my phone may need to first hand off from sector 3 to sector 2, and then from sector 2 to sector 1, but there may not be enough time because the elevator may be going too fast. That was the point of that slide. And as far as the calculating how many sectors, based on the number of people and the usage pattern of the applications, we will go into more details on the next webinar.
Okay, thanks. Another one that just came in, MADR is not taking into account the number of active users. Would it really represent the throughput? I'm not sure if that came out.
MADR, it's a maximum achievable data rate. That is really what can one user get under ideal conditions. That's basically, if you have multiple users, then yes, each user will get less than that. So it basically is sharing, right? But MADR is what one user can get ideally at the maximum conditions. It doesn't really take into account retransmissions or anything like that. It does take into account the fact that there is overhead in LTE, so we do not take, we only take into account PDSCH when we are calculating MADR. So overhead is taken into account, but retransmission is not. So yes, this is only a single user, and it is maximum achievable data rate for one single user. It is not for multiple users.
Okay, thank you. One last question. We're going to do, how do you position your antennas in a building with an atrium in the middle?
Oh, yes. Okay, that is an excellent question that we have received before the webinar. So now what you would, if you are going to put Omni, and this is a similar question as to how do you direct your signal away from outside. Here you would want to direct your signal away from the atrium on the higher levels, and you would want your lowest level to actually provide a signal to your atrium. So what I would suggest is the same thing as I have suggested from when I have shown that solution that uses directional antenna that points toward the middle of the floor plan. So here, if you have an atrium, you would basically want to point antennas facing away from the atrium toward the end of the building. Here, let me just actually go through those slides to illustrate what I'm trying to say. Okay, so let's say that in the middle of this, there is an atrium right here. So you have a big void in the middle. So what you would want to do is you would want to point an antenna here, directional, and point in this direction. And this one point this direction to try to not to have much of a signal coming into this middle area. It is very challenging design because depending on where you put that antenna, you may have a lot of leakage in here. So this is a problem that is very difficult to solve. You have to look into what exactly it is that you have in the building, whether there is perhaps some isolation here, if there is any wall or windows on each level that are facing the atrium. But the point being is that you are going to try to direct the antennas away from the atrium as much as possible on all levels except for the first floor. The first floor may actually have the antennas that are targeting atrium for coverage. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you're going to end up all those sectors covering the atrium. So you're going to have multiple sectors covering the atrium, and then your UEs may hop from one sector to another all the time.
Okay, thank you, Vladan. So we're out of time for today's session, but I'd like to thank everyone who joined us and for all of your interesting questions. To continue the conversation, I'll start a thread on our LinkedIn group, the iBwave user group. If you're not a member yet, I encourage you to join us. Even if you're not an actual iBwave user, anyone can join. And we can continue there. Also, if you asked a question that we didn't answer just now, we'll get back to you via email. You can look for a recording and the slide deck from today's presentation in your inbox within the next couple of days. And the video recording will be up on our website as well. And lastly, the written case study that we used to develop this webinar will be available on our blog by tomorrow. So if you want to read it and recheck all the details, you can visit our blog there. Thank you again to our presenter, Vladan. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today. Have a great day, and I will now disconnect the call.